to Around Kansas. I'm Deb Goodrich,
And I'm Michelle Martin.
and I cannot believe we are this far into October. And if it's October, that means it is the anniversary of Price's invasion of Missouri, and one of the most significant events in Kansas history, and certainly in the Civil War in the West. And that's exactly what is behind me. This is a piece of that story, the Mine Creek battle. And I think, Michelle, this one of Samuel Reeder's illustration?
Actually, that is an original painting by Andy Thomas.
Oh, it is. You're right. Oh my gosh. I am so going blind. I had a Samuel Reeder saved, and then I decided to go with this one. So I'm so glad that somebody's got their thinking cap on today. Andy has depicted some incredible pieces. His image of the gorillas charging, is, oh my word. It's like it will make your blood run cold. It is amazing. So I'm so glad you could tell when I'm too blind to see which picture I put up here, what I've got. So yeah, shout out to Andy Thomas, who is an incredible artist. And yours is from an actual film set.
Yes, it is. Actually, this is when Bill Curtis worked with the History Channel on a series called Investigating History. He wanted to bring more attention to the Battle of Mine Creek, and he called it the Lost Battle of the Civil War. Because when Price invades, and when he starts his invasion of Missouri and comes down into Kansas in 1864, really the election is the news. The war
Oh,
east of the Mississippi, the election is, the run up to the election is the news. And so the Battle of Mine Creek gets lost in all of that. And so we actually were able to recreate the Battle of Mine Creek. And you see behind me many fine individuals. As a matter of fact, David Carrico and many of his cavalry troopers are in this image. And we actually filmed on the battlefield at Mine Creek and filmed the various cavalry charges and to recreate the battle for the History Channel. So this was taken on a very, very hot July weekend when we filmed. And I think our temperatures were in at the 100-degree mark, and it was exceedingly hot. And I have to say, we were very fortunate. We did not lose any men or horses. We only had occasional minor bumps, scrapes, and bruises. We did not have any major injuries. It was actually a really safe shoot, and it was a fantastic time for everyone. I actually shot this from the back of a John Deere Gator. Um, Bill Curtis, I had never met him before. He saw me filming. I was actually using a a digital camera, and it was just what I could afford on my salary at the time. And he happened to look over my shoulder and was looking at my viewfinder and looking at my screen and seeing my images. And he handed me a video camera. I have a video camera that runs about $45,000, and handed it to me and said, "Here, you should be shooting with something like this." And he said, "Here's what I want you to do. Get in the back of that gator. I'm going to drive, and the horses are going to charge toward us. Oh, and you might want to strap yourself down." And so we took a rope and put it through the loops on the belt loops on my jeans, tied me off to the bed of the gator. And he said, "If you can hang off the back of the gator, that'd be great. If you could film holding it low so you see the legs of the horses coming at you." And naively, I went, "Sure, okay."
sure.
So nothing like learning how to film trial by fire.
Well, that's, the best way to learn anything, I guess. The election that Michelle's talking about, the election of 1864, of course, the big question was, would Abraham Lincoln be reelected to see us through the remainder, hopefully the near end of the Civil War? In Kansas, there was a pretty important election going on too. and that was the governor's race. And because of so much writing on the election of the governor and the president, when the powers that be, that when the people in Kansas felt threatened because Price had invaded Missouri and was moving toward Fort Leavenworth, obviously, and then who knows, the Lawrence massacre was only a year distant.
Mm-hmm.
Who knew how far he would come? And you had, breastworks thrown up in Topeka. I mean, people were scared all along the border. So they start raising men, to go and defend Kansas. But they were really afraid to let them get too far, lest they not be able to get home to vote. And that was
Mm-hmm.
a big debate at the time, whether or not these guys would get home to vote. And so it was a toss up. Are you more worried about being attacked and burned out, or are you more afraid of losing the election? And in fact, Samuel Crawford, who is my favorite Kansas governor of all time, was nominated for the governorship. He was on General Curtis's staff, the commanding. What was he? The Department of the West, Department of
Mm-hmm.
Missouri. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
Department of Missouri.
Yeah, so he is the commanding general, and Crawford is on his staff, and he actually is nominated while in the field, and he comes home to Topeka, makes an acceptance speech. He was an attorney from Garnett who had served in the first Congress, or I mean the first legislature in Kansas, and
Mm-hmm.
had resigned when Lincoln issued that call for men to put down the rebellion. And so, much like Lee Taffanelli, who was our adjutant general a few years ago in Kansas, was a Kansas legislator and resigned from that position to go fight in Afghanistan. Um, Governor Crawford, soon to be Governor Crawford, resigned as a legislator. Then he is elected while on the battlefield. In the aftermath of Mine Creek,
Mm-hmm.
he is elected, and he was very proud of being one of the war governors. They called themselves the war governors, the men who held that position during the Civil War. And after the war was over, then of course the Indian Wars, the Plains Indian Wars, are in full force, and Kansas is front and center. It is getting the brunt of it, and Crawford resigns from the governorship to lead Kansans on the field to protect its citizens. There were so many things going on, and Crawford made this famous speech. He was quoted in the paper: "The blood of my people cries out to me, and I must avenge." And he's been begging Sheridan and those guys to let him raise a regiment, and finally they did. And he resigned the governorship to lead that regiment. And he is just the most fascinating story. Then spends much of his law career afterward defending Indian land claims. Um,
Mm-hmm.
is fascinating,
He
fascinating.
is incredible. And Deb, you mentioned the fact that when Price launches that ill-fated invasion through Missouri, his stated goal is to go ahead and take back the capital. He's going to go to Jeff City. He
Right.
wants to take it back. He then wants to go ahead and launch this major offensive to go ahead and take back the border counties in Kansas. And he wants to set up this defensive position so he can go ahead and make inroads into Kansas. And a lot of this is payback for what had taken place during the territorial period from 1854 to 1861. And what he doesn't count on is the resolve of Kansans and others to push back against him. But what's incredible, you mentioned the fact that, he's got this objective. He wants to take Kansas City. He wants to have control of Westport because it's an
Leavenworth.
Leavenworth, but Westport's important for
Mm-hmm.
shipping
Yep.
because if you control Westport and Westport Landing, you control the ability to move supplies, men, and
Right.
materials. If you control Leavenworth, you control a critical juncture and a place
Arsenal.
for supplies and an arsenal. But
Yeah.
he also turns his sights toward Fort Scott. And
Hmm.
even though the post had been sold off at auction in after 1854, it had been recommissioned by the military and was an active post during the Civil War. As a matter of fact, the third of all things, the third Wisconsin Cavalry is stationed out of Fort Scott, and they're very important. You know, your first regiment, first, second, and third regiments of Indian Home Guard are brought in and out of service at Fort Scott. The first Kansas Colored. But Fort Scott is also a major refugee hub, and it
Hmm.
is a place where contraband, which is the name that was given to escaping African Americans who were fleeing from slavery in Missouri, contraband are coming over to Fort Scott for safety. So taking Fort Scott gives you an important supply post on that road that goes from Fort Scott to Fort Gibson and gives you direct control of Indian Territory. So in Fort Scott, they are terrified. They hear Price is coming and they literally evacuate the town. I have a diary of a woman who came from Ohio to visit her family in Fort Scott. And she talks about leaving Fort Scott, she sews jewelry inside her corset because she said she had heard that even though they're Southern men and they're rebels, that they would not molest the person of a woman. Therefore, her jewelry and money would be safe if it was sewn inside the layers of her corset. They talk about taking china and silver and putting it in crates and burying it out in the prairie. And she literally lived in a wagon and in a barn until they get the all clear after the Battle of Mine Creek. And she
Right.
talks about coming back through the battlefield. And she talks about, the aftermath of that battle on October 24th. And folks, for those of you not familiar, the Battle of Mine Creek is the second largest cavalry engagement of the entire American Civil War, second only to Brandy Station.
That's
And
incredible. The
it
thousands
is.
and thousands of horses that were
And
there
men.
is unimaginable. It's
Mhm.
unimaginable. Um,
And
Go ahead.
this woman, Emma Caroline Morley, she writes about coming back to Fort Scott and they come through the area of the battle. And she writes about seeing the bodies of the dead all over.
Hmm.
And she says that they happened upon the body of a Confederate and they knew he was a Confederate by his clothing, but that she said, I think in life he must have been a handsome fellow. Um, and she feels sorry for his family. But
Hmm.
she talks also about the horses that were killed in the battle and the stench of it wasn't the stench of the rotting men, but it was the stench of the horses that was so overwhelming to her, and how it was overpowering, and there had been nothing like it that she had ever smelled in her life before.
It, as Michelle said, was the second largest cavalry engagement of the entire Civil War, and does get kind of lost in the overall history.
Mhm.
One, because the Trans Mississippi was deemed not as significant. We all know that's not true, but that was the kind of the prevailing notion of the time.
Mhm.
So, but don't ever let that convince you that the powers that be on both sides of the Mason Dixon line were looking westward to see what was going to happen. Because had Price been successful, and there's no reason other than, like Michelle said, the resolve of those people standing up against him, that he couldn't have been. It was a sound plan.
Mhm.
Price is a war hero. He is a veteran of the Mexican War. He is truly a larger than life figure at 6'6", according to some accounts, and a pretty big guy. Um,
Yes.
by the time he gets around to this part of his life, he's gotten pretty heavy, and they. I don't know if they didn't want a horse to suffer through carrying Price, or if he was a little concerned about getting off and on the horse, but he commanded from a buggy or a wagon
Hmm.
uh, during this invasion. But he captured men and material. He
Yes.
had a wagon train that was more than 20 miles long.
There were
So
over 500 wagons in that wagon train,
unbelievable,
but
unbelievable.
that's the albatross around his neck because,
Yeah,
folks, the only reason Price does not succeed, he has that huge wagon train,
yeah,
and it's not just materials, there are civilians in
yeah.
that wagon train, and goods and materials. And that wagon train, and he doesn't quite know the lay of the land around Mine Creek, and he does not realize how high the banks are for the creek. And there's one really good ford to cross the creek where they're coming through. And after a certain number of wagons get through, that ford kind of washes out, and he strands a good part of the wagon train, his artillery pieces, and the majority of his men on the other side of the creek. And he and those who are ahead of, that are with him, continue moving toward Fort Scott, not realizing that that ford has washed out. And then the rest of the troops are behind. And when he receives word that they're stuck behind and they have to kind of pull up and see what happens, he literally is playing this waiting game. What am I going to do? And these men are literally stuck and they have nothing to do. Their backs are to a creek. So they have no choice but to stand and fight. And they do. And the the Missouri forces fight valiantly. But they are out and the thing is they're not outnumbered. The Union forces at Mine Creek are very small compared to what Price has, but the Union forces have better and more well-rested men. They have more horses, but they also have repeating rifles. And Price's men have muskets. They've got single shot muzzle loaders. That's what they've got to fight with. You've got cavalrymen who've got revolvers. Some of them have got on their saddles, they've got their holsters and they've got two revolvers on the saddle, and some of them have extras tucked in their belts plus their Henrys or their Spencers. And then when they run out, when they, empty all their weapons, they're not afraid to go into saber charge and, if need be, hand to hand combat. And that's what it becomes at Mine Creek. And it is absolutely, for some of the men there, they remember it as the fiercest, most brutal fighting they ever encountered during the war.
Um, there are a lot of historic sites associated with Price's invasion of Missouri, and he came up out of Arkansas. He was going to head toward St. Louis. He winds up basically traveling what's now Highway 24
Hmm.
across Missouri, and again planned to hit Leavenworth. He turns south, comes into Kansas City and Westport probably before he wanted to. Um,
Hmm.
did a staff ride when I was at the Command and General Staff College, consulting and volunteering with Ed Kennedy and Tom Chichota, and we had a group of French majors and their colonel, and we did basically the Battle of the Blue, and that's one piece.
Hmm.
So you've got all these battles at this time of year that are a piece of Price's invasion. So this is so politically incorrect, but we go to, we were doing this in spring of the year, it was early April, and we go to Byram's Ford there in the Kansas City area. And so we've got all these French guys standing around, and Ed Kennedy, God bless him, it's spring and the buds are just popping out and everything. And Ed's in the middle of his presentation, and he's like, I think I hear a frog. And the guys just looked at him like, really? All the French guys are like, really? Oh my gosh, it was hilarious. They were the best guys. They were just phenomenal. So you've got all those sites. We actually started that part of the tour around Buckner, Missouri. there on
Mm-hmm.
Highway 24. And there are all kinds of historical markers right there on the highway. Stop and read those. I think Freedom's Frontier, again, has some great
Mm-hmm.
maps and locations. So you can you can follow Price's entire
Yes, you
invasion.
can.
But if you're right there on the Kansas-Missouri line, you could start up around Buckner and just follow it all the way
Mm-hmm.
down to Mine Creek. And you could do that in a day, couldn't you, Michelle? You could.
Yeah, you could. Unless you're on the tour I went on. One of my first tours of Mine Creek was actually with our good friend and my sergeant major Arnold Schofield,
Well, I was just about to
and
mention him.
none other than our late departed wonderful colleague and friend Ed Bars. And Ed and Arnold were doing a bus tour, and I was on that tour. Oh my gosh. I don't know what was better, being on that tour with Arnold and Ed, or doing a tour at Pea Ridge with Arnold and Ed. But Ed was so alive and electric, and he had that way about him. And
He was
we were
always a
out.
Marine. He was
Yes,
always a Marine.
yes.
So,
And so we were out on the battlefield. And if you go to the battlefield, folks, if you walk, they have beautiful walking paths.
yes. Yeah.
And if you walk out the main path, you'll see what looks like a great big red target. And that is actually the center of battle, where the two lines come together, where the Union and Confederate forces come together and first begin combat there. And so we're standing there, and Ed, in his way, says, "And at this point," and he points out toward the red target, "the lines came together, and it was thunderous." And he just exploded into his narrative, and it was priceless.
Oh, yeah.
The only thing, that was more fun was also to ride the battlefield or walk the battlefield with also our very dear departed friend, Dr. John Spencer, who was
Mhm.
with the Battlefield Foundation for so many years and poured his heart and soul into Mine Creek. And
Right.
um, I had many opportunities to also, walk the battlefield with my Colonel Spencer, as I called him. And it really is, folks, do yourself a favor. If you have not been to Mine Creek, go this month before they close. They
Yeah.
close for the season on Saturday, October 23rd. Go, and it's a very nominal fee. Uh, Go in the visitor center. See the exhibits. They have beautiful exhibits. You can actually see that original Andy Thomas painting that's behind Deb. You can see that painting. They have a lovely little gift shop. But then you can get a map, and you can do the walking tour. You actually, at the facility, they have a monument that is to all of the soldiers who died and fought at the battle, both Union and Confederate. But then also there is a lovely little area that has a little small grove of trees, where we know archaeologically a large number of Confederate soldiers who died at the battle are buried in that area. And there is our good friend Colonel Jim Speicher, and
Passed away. Who just
no,
passed away. Yes. Yes.
oh,
Yes. I know. Gosh, day. This. Yeah.
he Jim
It's terrible.
Speicher, more than anyone, worked to preserve the Confederate stories that came out of the battle.
Yep.
And he cared less about the politics of the battle and more about the individual experiences of the men there.
Right.
And he and the Sons of Confederate Veterans Camp that he was a member of for so long have a monument there. And
Mhm.
it is, it is not about extolling the myth of the lost cause. It is about commemorating and marking where men fell in battle and where they rest. And it is a place for the descendants of those men to come and pay their respect, because it is a
Right.
battlefield. It is a place of burial. And so you can see that. Fall is one of the most beautiful
It
times to see
really
the
is.
battlefield.
It's the
Um,
perfect time.
it is gorgeous. And I myself was on the Battlefield Foundation board for many years, volunteered at the battlefield for many years. And there's a lot of my blood, sweat, and tears on that battlefield as well. And folks, our historic sites, especially because of COVID, they really need our help. And Mine Creek is one of those. So please learn about this very important battle. Go visit the site. Tell them that Deb and Michelle from around Kansas sent you. I don't know, they might kick you out, but tell them we sent you. And if you do, go visit Mine Creek and then go on down to Fort Scott and visit Fort Scott, National Historic Site that was Price's objective to obtain. Go visit there. If you want to continue your visit, then keep heading south on Highway 69 and go to Baxter Springs, another town that has connections to the Civil War. You can actually make an entire Civil War day of it. Like Deb said, start in Buckner, head down, go to Mine Creek, go to Fort Scott, go to Baxter Springs, and learn more about that time in Kansas history because it is so incredibly important and fascinating.
It really is a real cast of characters. We'll be right back.
In 1821, a trade route was opened from Missouri in the United States across prairies and mountains to Mexico. In 2021, we will mark 200 years of epic conflicts and grand adventures, larger-than-life personalities, and sweeping landscapes. Join us on an historic journey. The Santa Fe Trail lives on.
Find us on social media or santafetrail.org. Welcome to the Western Kansas Wildlife Travel Center, right here in my hometown of Oakley, Kansas. We're the front door of Western Kansas, located on 3 main highways, I-70, US 83, and US 40. And all those roads lead to history, beautiful scenery, and adventure, no matter which direction you go. We now have an IHOP. That brand that you've trusted up and down the road in all your travels is staffed with local folks, real people, just like you and me, and we're waiting on you to join us. So for fun, adventure, fuel up, fuel your body, and let's have some fun.
Welcome back. And isn't that a cool hat I've got going on right there? I love this picture of this porcupine, actually. I believe this may be an artistic rendering. Looks a little bit like Albert Durer, but since I messed up so bad on Andy Thomas, I'm afraid to make a guess on this. So, but it's a pretty cool porcupine, or porcupine, as a European friend once pronounced it, not understanding that the rules of pronunciation in English make no sense at all. So,
And I have a little more sedate porcupine over my shoulder. Obviously, this fellow or young lady is a little more chill. Maybe she's had her porcupine chill pill, and or maybe he's getting ready for a snack and doesn't feel the need to fluff all those quills out.
well, I got to thinking about porcupines the other day when we went down to Oklahoma City for the Order of the Indian Wars fall tour, which was just fantastic. But we, from Oakley to Oklahoma City, there's no way to get there. So you kind of zigzag and go through some really, really pretty country, but pretty much off the main roads, a lot of it off the main roads. There were a lot of run over porcupines. I don't know what it was, because you can go forever and never see one. So I don't know if they've got some reason to cross the road right now. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. There's this great bluegrass song, Armadillo Suicide. Was it for love, or, why did they feel the need to cross the road? And I was thinking that about these poor porcupines. But who knows what lingers in the mind of a porcupine? But they are fascinating creatures.
For me, the sad part about the porcupine is I absolutely love their little faces. Their faces are so adorable. And you just want to reach out and cuddle them, but they're just not very cuddly.
Not very cuddly. And Michelle just looked it up. We were wondering, are they related to the very cuddly hedgehog? No, it's just another one. Like I was sure that devil's claw and okra were in the same family. No, they are not. Nor is the little hedgehog and the porcupine. But we do know a few things about porcupines, and we went back in the vault to bring that story to you today.
In all the animal kingdom, there are some strange little beasts. The duck-billed platypus was a favorite oddity. Or closer to home, catfish are pretty strange when you start thinking about it. For that matter, prairie dogs with their yipping and burrowing and popping up and down like a whack-a-mole game are pretty preposterous. But the strangest of the common creatures here has to be the porcupine. Despite years of plundering through the woods and fields and prairies, I have never encountered a porcupine in the wild, and I must say I am most grateful. Dr. Jake acknowledges that he, too, has never seen one in the wild, but has doctored dogs and horses with quills in their snouts. That is close enough for me. Porcupines are large, slow-moving rodents that can be distinguished from other Kansas mammals by 1, their heavy body and relatively small head and ears, 2, their thick muscular tail, and 3, their brownish black to black upper parts with light yellow guard hairs and yellow barbed spines tipped with black, loosely attached to the skin and concentrated on the rump and tail. 4, buffy and spineless underparts. 5, broad orange, red incisors. And 6, large feet with naked soles and strong curved claws. Sexes are alike in color and size, young or darker than adults. Porcupines occur throughout Kansas, except perhaps in the southeastern portion of the state. They inhabit forest, riparian communities, and associated rock outcrops. Until the mid-19th century, native tribes used the quills to decorate clothing and baskets, effectively embroidering the dyed quills into intricate designs. As trade with Europeans increased and expanded, quills were pretty much replaced by beads. Other than the occasional curious dog or unfortunate horse, the reclusive porcupine does not relinquish his quills easily. Like many bizarre features, the quills are there to protect him. If a porcupine feels threatened, it puffs up its body to show off the coat of barbed quills and either tucks its head underneath or sticks it into a tree or rock crevice. If the foe is close enough, the little beast slaps its enemy with its tail, slinging dozens of quills into the nose of its attacker. Understandably, porcupines are loners. Though several might share a den in the winter, they are primarily nocturnal, but may venture out during the day. Their range varies from up to 14 hectares in the summer to about 5 in the winter. What the heck is a hectare? Well, it's about 100 acres. Winter food often means spending time in trees, where the inner bark is one of their favorite foods. Porcupines also like evergreen needles. They rarely do significant damage unless their population density booms for some reason. In summer, they eat buds, berries, twigs, and herbs. Like many animals, they gnaw on antler shed or bones for calcium and other nutrients. Numbers fluctuate from year to year and may range from 1 to 10 animals per square kilometer. Although not territorial, porcupines sometimes defend their winter feeding trees from other individuals. Porcupines do not make a nest or a burrow. They den in rock crevices or tree hollows. Porcupines breed in late autumn after an elaborate courtship ritual initiated by the females. After a gestation period of about 30 weeks, a female will give birth in the spring to a single young, rarely two. At birth, the large young porcupine, weighing around a pound, has long, thick black hair and short, soft spines. Its incisor teeth are already present, and its eyes and ears are open and functional at birth, though porcupines do not really have very good eyesight. In 10 days, it is weaned and capable of climbing trees. In 2 years, the young porcupine becomes mature enough to reproduce. Bobcats are the principal predators of porcupines in Kansas, although coyotes are capable of killing this animal. Forest fires are a threat to porcupines. The barbed, banded spines of the porcupine are actually modified hairs and, despite superstitious beliefs, cannot be thrown. The lonely little porcupine can live as long as 20 years.
Howdy, I'm Seth Hayes, and welcome to my hometown, from then to now. Council Grove has a rich history, as deep as the prairie tallgrass. Spend the day visiting 25 historic sites, or explore the unique shops and restaurants, or mosey out of town along the Santa Fe Trail. You all visit my hometown, Council Grove, in the heart of the Flint Hills.
Okay, looks like it's time for our tour. Welcome to the Fort Wallace Museum. Here at the museum, you're going to find some really interesting stuff, like our replica stagecoach from the Butterfield Overland Dispatch. We've got facades from the fort buildings. We've got an 1870s flag. There's a plesiosaur that was discovered locally. We've got the Ray pump organ collection. We're a little bitty place with a great big story, and we'd love to have you.
Welcome back to Around Kansas. I'm Michelle Martin.
I'm Deb Goodrich.
And it is our fun segment. And because we are still in the month of October, yes, you guessed it, we're going to take you to cemeteries just because we can.
And we love it. The fun just doesn't end. I want to remind you of a tour that's coming up this weekend, October 23rd. And this is at the Sunset Lawn Cemetery in El Dorado. And our dear friend Ken Spurgeon and the Butler County Historical Society have 3 tours. They did some last weekend. They're doing 3 more this Saturday, 4:30, 5:30, and 6:30. And included on this cemetery tour, in addition to all the interesting folks in El Dorado, is Reuben Waller, who is one of our personal favorite people in history. So yeah, that would be a great time. And this is also the cemetery, not to give any secrets away, but this is where Barack Obama's grandmother is buried. So yeah, so that's going to be an awesome tour. So I so wish I could be there for that one.
You know, continuing with Deb's theme, everything leads back to Topeka Cemetery, historic Topeka Cemetery. The marker you see behind me today is that for a gentleman named Black Hawk. And Black Hawk was a Potawatomi man who lived in Kansas and actually has the rather grisly distinction of being the first individual murdered in the city of Topeka in March of 1861. And his is just one of many stories you can find in the Topeka Cemetery. I did not know about Black Hawk until Deb lived in the cemetery when she was the historian in residence there. And we went out one evening for a walk, and we came upon his grave here you see behind me. And I started digging in and doing research and found that it was fascinating. Obviously, because he was the first murder in Topeka,
Right.
but also the fact that he had befriended a gentleman named Isaac Edwards, who was known to be of somewhat dubious character, had a problem with alcohol, and was taking Edwards on horseback to the ferry. And in the course of that ride, Edwards brandished a knife and stabbed Black Hawk twice. And then passersby ended up coming upon the body of Black Hawk lying on the road, on the way to the ferry, and he died of his wounds. And what's fascinating about his story is how the residents of Topeka rallied around Black Hawk,
Mm-hmm.
an American Indian man, at a time when, in our country, when, because of the Civil War, because of the border conflict between Kansas and Missouri, race relations were not always harmonious. And here we have the white residents of Topeka rallying around an American Indian man, and they saw that he received a proper and fitting burial. And then some individuals took the law into their own hands and decided to go to the jail and drag Edwards out of the jail because they wanted immediate justice for the murder of their friend Blackhawk, a man who was trusted and beloved by many of Topeka's residents.
It, yeah, it is a sad but uplifting story, in some ways. I'm trying to remember when the marker was added, because that was obviously sometime later, after I moved to Topeka, but I can't remember, through the efforts of so many awesome folks. I remember Randy Teese having been involved in some of those, getting markers for people who did not have them. One of the ones that I know Randy was very much involved in, when Topeka became a town, it was founded December 5th, 1854. And the mission was nearby where the State Historical Society is now. And there were a few residents scattered here and there. The original burying ground is basically a block from where the State House is now, at the intersection of what's now 10th and Kansas Avenue. So as the town grew from 54 to 59, the powers that be are like, we need a proper cemetery. So they go to Dr. Franklin Crane. Dr. Crane was a dentist who came from Pennsylvania, and he was a widower, and he brought his 4 grown sons, and he was a man of means, and he built a very fine home east of Topeka, out in the rolling countryside. It was such a picturesque setting. And so the powers that be came to Dr. Crane and they said, "You have the perfect place for a garden cemetery." And he agreed. And so he went into the cemetery business. And the cemetery office for a while was downtown, and then it was there on the grounds. And then, of course, eventually it's in his home. And then the upstairs became an apartment. So Dr. Crane, we had talked before about segregation in cemeteries, and Dr. Crane designated part of Topeka Cemetery as the African way, not to segregate it by any means, but to let African Americans know they were welcome. They are buried throughout the cemetery, any place they chose, they could and could afford, like everybody else, they could be buried. But when they moved the bodies, there were, I think, about 200 people buried at 10th and Kansas by the time they created Topeka Cemetery. And so they moved those bodies. And of course, some of those probably died in trail crossings, or people who had, stopped temporarily in Topeka and then went on. So they were building an office building downtown in the 1980s and came across 2 bodies, bones, just the bones of what was identified as a man and a woman. And they were placed in a one coffin and buried in Topeka Cemetery, and a marker is there, and it says they're unknown. And I'm like, it's kind of wild to think, did these people know each other? Did they like each other if they did? And here, eternity with your bones mingled with what might be a stranger. That would be a premise for a great ghost story. That would really, you could write a whole novel around that.
You could.
but it's just one of those really, really interesting stories. And, we assumed that those folks were left behind because there wasn't family there to make sure they got moved.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but the marking goes on. I was at the Order of the Indian Wars the other day, and we were talking with a couple of different groups who are involved, the Cavalry Association. Almost every organization I belong to is involved somehow in making sure that people have monuments or that they're remembered.
Mm-hmm.
And so that Black Hawk monument is beautiful. It's
Is.
a really nice monument, and yeah, a testament to how well thought of he was.
Speaking of well thought of and a testament to people, Fort Scott Evergreen Cemetery has a section that is a segregated area, and it was for the communities and the county's African American residents. Actually, the parents of famed photographer Gordon Parks are buried there. Actually, Gordon is buried there as well. But also in that segregated section, for many years, the bodies of Moses Holt and his sister, Mary Holt Blakey, were there slumbering in their eternal rest without any markers. And it is interesting how people in the present become connected to these people in the past and almost adopt them like family. And my good friend Carolyn Cooper, who sadly is no longer with us, Carolyn was really instrumental in researching just monumental amounts of information about the African American residents of Fort Scott. And she discovered newspaper articles and all kinds of materials about Moses and Mary. And Moses and Mary both came to Kansas from the Indian Territory. Moses joined the army, and his sister Mary ended up becoming served as a nurse at the hospital in Fort Scott. And so, of course, after the war, they both would be eligible for a pension, but
Right.
also they would be eligible to have grave markers that came from the Veterans Administration. And so Carolyn, in tandem with our good friend Sandra Sue Hammerall, and of course the one and only Arnold Schofield, our Sergeant Major, did extensive research and were able to finally locate the precise locations where Moses and Mary were both buried in the segregated section of Evergreen in Fort Scott Cemetery. And they were able to get the military markers for both of them. And what was so, I guess, poignant about it was the fact that when they got the markers and they had a wonderful ceremony to unveil Moses's marker, Carolyn was battling cancer at the time. And one thing I've always been so grateful for is the fact that she was able to see the outcome of so much work that she put into helping find the historical material to build out the story of his life and of Mary's life, and to make sure that they both were commemorated with the markers she felt they deserved. And I was so glad she got to see that before she passed away, because it meant so much to her. But she would talk to you about people she was researching in the cemeteries, and you almost felt like they were her family because she became so attached to them. And I guess it's just, I don't know, it's a side effect of being a historian, being a genealogist, being a researcher, or just being someone who cares so much like she did. And so I have to kind of chuckle when I find myself going through cemetery photos looking for something, and I think Carolyn would absolutely laugh and shake her finger at me and say, "See, I told you so. There's good stuff in the cemetery all the time."
My my sister Denise, who lives back home in the hills, said one time that she didn't know if I was talking about somebody on the phone, if it was my neighbor or somebody that had been dead 150 years. So, yep, I can relate. I can relate. I've got to mention the photo behind me was taken last year at the Waukene State Veterans Cemetery when they could not have their normal gathering, and Dr. Jake and his buddies always do a ride through and with the riderless horse, and sometimes they're in the uniforms of Indian Wars soldiers. They did uniforms of World War I soldiers a year or two ago. And this time they had, that's Marla, our friend Marla, Widow's Weeds, walking with them this year. And I think they had several different services, branches of service represented in the gathering. But that's a really lovely, lovely place in Waukene, and they're doing just such a beautiful job keeping the memories alive, of these servicemen and women and their families. So really beautiful, really beautiful.
Well, Deb, I really think this time of year, of course, we are very tongue in cheek in the sense that we're talking about cemeteries during October, and because it's spooky and creepy this time of year. But really, cemeteries are filled with so much history, and and obviously there's so much humanity there if you look for it. And so, I encourage everyone, even if you're squeamish about death and dying and funerals and cemeteries, try taking a walk in one of our really beautiful park-like cemeteries in Kansas in the fall, because it is actually very soothing to your soul. I miss that about living. I live in Arizona in the desert, and you don't want to see what cemeteries look like here. They're not pretty. They're not park-like unless you're in some of the mountain communities. They're not very pretty. The only cemetery I enjoy going to visit is in Prescott. And it's the Pioneer Cemetery. And I go there because there's one very important person buried there that Deb and I both love, and that is the one and only Big Nose Kate. And so the last time Deb was here to visit me, we went to Prescott just so we could see Big Nose Kate. And but I miss that. I miss being able to just take a walk in the cemeteries because they are so garden and park like. With the benches, you can sit, you can take a beverage, you can sit, you can enjoy nature. I like hearing the birds, I like seeing the squirrels, but I do like looking around and finding things like Blackhawk's burial or others. And I always can't help but look and think, I wonder how long it's been since someone has stopped by and said hello to this person who's here. Do they even have family left in the area? And Carolyn was so sweet and kind. She adopted different families in the cemeteries that she had researched for so long, and she went out and decorated their graves and made sure that the decorations were changed out for the seasons. And she went out to visit them. Because she felt like they deserved having someone to visit them, to say hello, and to remember that they had lived and they were important. And so even if it's not your family, take a walk, say hello to them, honor them, respect them, and enjoy some beautiful Kansas air.
You can tell them that Deb and Michelle sent you too.
They probably will know that we sent you.
No. Before we go, you have got to share with our viewers your big award that you just accepted. We're very proud of you. And so share your great news with everybody.
Well, historians, one of the things that, especially graduate students, we apply for fellowships and awards and other things. And I was recently honored by the Coalition for Western Women's History with the Irene Ledesma Prize, and it is awarded each year to someone who is doing dissertation research that deals with gender and the history of gender in the American West. And my work looks at gender and race and ethnicity and how these things all come together through an interracial marriage. And so I've applied. This is the third time I applied, so the third time was the charm. But I applied for this award and found out in September that I received it, and I've had to keep it under wraps. And so I received the award, and unfortunately, because of COVID, I'm not able to travel to the conference to receive the award, but I was able to record a short video. And so in it, I thanked, of course, my family in Michigan, and as in the video, my legions of friends in Kansas and in Oklahoma, especially, because it's really my Kansas and my Oklahoma friends that have supported me so much as I've been working through my PhD, and I'm getting very close to being done. So, so I was able to thank them in my little video accepting the award. So that's pretty nice. It's a nice award. It's nice to be recognized. I'm very honored and very humbled, and the money that comes with it is also very nice too. That's one thing, graduate students, we apply for awards. It's a lot of work to do the award applications and the packets, but we also do it because the funding that comes in helps our research. So that is super important too. So it's nice to be recognized.
Very proud of you, and your hard work deserves recognition. So we're thrilled to see that.
So, well, thank you. And thank you and love to all my Kansas friends, because I know lots of you watch when we stream online. You all knew me when I was just the little girl working at Fort Scott Community College. And so, yep, you folks have been with me from the beginning. So couldn't have done it without my Kansas and my Oklahoma posse.
All right, folks. We've loved spending time with you today, and we'll see you again next week. In the meantime, I'm Deb Goodrich.
I'm Michelle Martin.
And we'll see you somewhere around Kansas.
Around Kansas.
Bye-bye.